My name is Thomas Hodka. I'm the director of the Center for Global and International Studies, one of the organizing centers that you see over there on the right-hand side of the screen. Welcome to today's panels and discussions. Any of you who've been here thus far have already had experience with some very stimulating panels and conversations, including a viewing of the film My Perestroika and a conversation with the director Robin Hessman afterwards, which was just very interesting, both the film and the conversation. So those are the sponsors we'd like to thank, and particularly, of course, we want to thank Edith Clues for her work and the work her staff have done to make all of this possible. Edith said, Edith has me listed here as opening remarks, and I was sort of thinking about a couple of things that came up out of the panel, so I just want to say a word or two. If you're committed, like I am, to the proposition that there is such a thing as political flourishing, which is part of the larger question of human flourishing, and if you believe that both kinds of well-being are associated with particular forms of political rule, or at least with particular qualities of political rule, then you are led to ponder the relationship between some of the big picture issues we have talked about at this conference thus far, and the little pictures that we see, for example, in My Perestroika, but also in our own lives. So to give one personal example about how I think of this and how I have puzzled through some of these questions actually through my whole career as a political scientist, during the famine that occurred in the Nigerian Civil War, also known as the Nigerian Biafran War between July of 1967 and January of 1970, and while still holding in memory the news they heard about the Great Chinese Famine between 1958 and 1961, parents in the part of the world where I grew up in the 1960s and 70s would say to their kids who didn't want to eat their supper, there are plenty of kids in China, Mark is nodding, or plenty of kids in Africa who would love to have what you're having for supper. As you might imagine, the impression this remark made on most of my friends was slight. Both of these famines were mostly caused by political decisions, and we really saw them as a very far away thing. But in my household, my father would say, when I was your age, I was starving and would have loved to have had the supper you're having. Eat your supper. Now, his claim was true, at least concerning short periods of time he endured just before and then during the Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe, and the impression this made on me was much stronger than the abstract concern for some Biafran or Chinese kids, especially since we didn't have a television on which we could see the images of starving children. So to turn the corner, it was some 3 or 4 years ago that a Chinese friend of mine who grew up in Beijing was telling me about his recollections of the Great Chinese Famine, and how his parents would scoop an extra bit of the small ration of rice they had in their bowls, sort of off the top of the bowl, and give it to him and his older brother. He recalled how after the famine, conditions were still bad, but his family was a little bit better off. When they went to a restaurant, there would be several hungry kids standing around the table, as he described it, waiting for them to finish so they could pick up the scraps. He disliked that memory very much, and to this day he especially detests seeing any food of any kind getting wasted. I had to smile because my parents were exactly the same way. Wasting food to them was, just as it had been to a generation of people growing up during the Great Depression in the United States, pretty much a sin. You just didn't waste food. It leads me to reflect on how these three very different mega experiences of the Chinese famine, of the expulsion of many Eastern Europeans after the Second World War, and the Great Depression in the US, all at least in part the consequences of political decisions, had such profound effects on the lived experiences of so many. How these experiences are strongly parallel in some cases, and how despite their differences they can be shared in a common human understanding. No doubt nearly everyone in this room can share similar small picture stories about human suffering and human flourishing in the context of the big events and the big decisions that overarch us all. It is useful as we look at megatrends, shifts in community identities, and the like, to think about those lived experiences as perhaps being that which motivated many of us to get into this academic business in the first place, because it is those lived experiences that first brought to our consciousness the puzzles that animate us in our desire for understanding. So with that, I want to thank Edith Clues and her staff again for putting this conference together. Thank you to the panelists, to the moderators and speakers for their good work, and thank you to the participants, and may you all have an interesting day today discussing the topics, that we have at hand.